The dust devil whirled across the parched ground like a vengeful spirit lifting grit and debris into the merciless afternoon sun. Clara Hensley's bare knees struck the splintered wooden steps of St. Matthew's Chapel with a sickening thud that echoed across the silent town square. The impact sent shockwaves through her 17-year-old frame, but she bit back the cry of pain that threatened to escape her chapped lips. Reverend Silas Boone towered above her, his black coat snapping in the desert wind like the wings of some predatory bird. The wooden cross in his weathered hands, rough-hewn and heavy as a club, trembled with barely contained fury as he pointed it at Clara's heaving chest. His voice boomed across the square with the authority of 10 years preaching fire and brimstone to the God-fearing folk of Redemption Creek. "You are banished for your sin, Clara Hensley." The words struck like physical blows. Cast out from this holy place and from the fellowship of decent Christian folk, Clara clutched the burlap sack containing her meager possessions, a tattered dress, a cracked mirror, and the last piece of hardtack she'd managed to save. Her shaking fingers wrapped around the rough fabric, but not from fear. After 7 years of servitude in the minister's household, after countless nights going hungry while he feasted after enduring his cruel tongue and crueler silences, she felt something else entirely burning in her chest. The townspeople had gathered in a semicircle around the chapel steps, their faces a mixture of curiosity and carefully maintained neutrality. Nobody dared question the minister's judgment, not in Redemption Creek, where his word was law and his influence reached into every corner of their hardscrabble existence. Let this be a lesson to all who would harbor wickedness in their hearts. Boone continued his cold gaze scanning the crowd. The Lord sees all transgressions, and his justice is swift and final. Clara struggled to her feet, her legs unsteady but her spine straight. She met the minister's unblinking stare without flinching, her green eyes blazing with defiance that had never been fully extinguished despite years of attempts to crush it. The church doors slammed shut behind her with a finality that seemed to echo across the entire territory, sealing her fate and casting her into the wilderness with nothing but her wits and the clothes on her back. As the crowd dispersed, Clara turned her back on the only home she'd known since she was 10 years old. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the jagged horizon, and she knew that nightfall in the territory brought dangers that could swallow a lone girl whole. But something nagged at her, a memory she couldn't quite grasp, something about the way the minister's eyes had lingered on her face when he'd spoken of her supposed sins. Clara's story had begun with death, as so many stories did, in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. Her parents had succumbed to what the minister had called cholera during the harsh winter of 1847, leaving her a wide-eyed 10-year-old with nowhere to go and no one to claim her. But even then, something had seemed wrong about their deaths, the way there had been no proper burial, no bodies for her to see, just the minister's solemn pronouncement that they had been taken by the Lord in his wisdom. The minister had taken her in, not out of Christian charity as he proclaimed from the pulpit, but because he needed someone to scrub his floors, tend his fires, and endure his fits of rage when the burdens of shepherding lost souls became too heavy for his shoulders. 7 years of servitude had hardened Clara in ways that a sheltered upbringing never could have. She'd learned to read faces in the flickering candlelight, to move silently through the minister's house when his temper was particularly foul, and to find food when there was none offered. Most importantly, she'd learned to observe, to watch and listen when adults thought she was simply another piece of furniture. It was during one of these moments of invisible observation that she'd witnessed something that would change everything. 3 days earlier, while cleaning the minister's private study, Clara had seen him carefully altering documents, changing names, dates, and land descriptions, with the practiced hand of someone who'd done such work before. The forged land document on his desk bore the name Yates in freshly altered ink, and when their eyes had met across the room, she'd seen something dark and dangerous flicker in his expression. "You didn't see anything," he'd said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of an unspoken threat. But Clara had seen, and she'd remembered. just as she'd remembered the strange circumstances of her parents' deaths, the families who had simply vanished from the territory, and the minister's sudden acquisition of properties that had once belonged to others. Now, as she walked the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, with her possessions clutched against her chest, Clara felt the weight of whispered conversations and sidelong glances. The townspeople had long viewed her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Pity for her orphaned state, suspicion for her sharp tongue, and refusal to bow her head in the face of cruelty. The town itself was a collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The saloon, the general store, the sheriff's office, and a handful of other establishments lined the main thoroughfare, while scattered homesteads dotted the surrounding valley. It was a place where life was measured in survival, where the strong prospered and the weak simply disappeared into the vast emptiness of the frontier. Daniel Yates had always been different from the other townspeople. The quiet rancher had treated Clara with basic human decency during her years of servitude, speaking to her as if she were a person rather than a piece of property. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, a familiarity that she couldn't quite place, as if he saw something in her face that reminded him of someone else. "You've got your mother's eyes," he'd said once when she delivered supplies to his homestead. Catherine always had that same stubborn spark. Clara had been surprised that he'd known her mother's name, had spoken of her with such familiarity. But before she could ask questions, the minister had appeared, and the conversation had ended abruptly. As Clara reached the edge of town, she paused to look back at the chapel's bell tower, silhouetted against the dying light. The bell had remained silent during her parents' supposed funeral, another detail that had struck her as strange at the time. She adjusted her grip on the burlap sack and turned toward the wild prairie that stretched endlessly before her, knowing that coyotes and desperate men both hunted when darkness fell. The first gunshot echoed across the valley. Just as the sun touched the horizon, a sharp crack that sent a chill down Clara's spine and quickened her steps toward whatever fate awaited in the gathering darkness. Something was happening out there in the wilderness, something that would soon draw her into a web of violence and deception that had been years in the making. Dawn broke with the harsh clarity that only desert mornings could provide, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Clara had spent the night huddled in a shallow depression behind a cluster of juniper trees, her ears tuned to every sound that might signal approaching danger. The temperature had dropped mercilessly after sunset, and her thin dress provided little protection against the bone-deep cold that seemed to seep up from the very earth. The memory of that gunshot had haunted her fitful sleep, and now, as she made her way toward the creek that gave the town its name, Clara found herself moving with the careful stealth that 7 years of navigating the minister's unpredictable moods had taught her. The sound of running water grew louder as she approached, and she quickened her pace, driven by thirst and the hope of washing the dust and grime from her face. What she found instead would change the course of her life forever. Daniel Yates lay crumpled in the mud at the water's edge, his flannel shirt dark with blood and his face pale as morning mist. Clara recognized him immediately, the same man who had spoken of her mother with such unexpected familiarity. His breathing was shallow and labored, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that she'd seen too many times during the harsh winters of her childhood. "Help me," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible above the babbling of the creek. His eyes struggled to focus on her face, recognition flickering in their depths. "Clara, girl, you shouldn't be here. Neither should you," Clara replied, already tearing strips from her spare dress to create makeshift bandages. She'd learned basic wound care from watching the town's doctor during his rare visits. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Daniel's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping her wrist. "My family." He gasped, his words coming in desperate bursts. "They're next. Minister wants the land, has to have it." Clara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. What do you mean? The forged land document. Daniel's other hand fumbled at his vest pocket, pulling out a folded paper stained with his blood. Evidence. Forgery. You have to warn them. The stained property title crackled as Clara unfolded it, her eyes scanning the official-looking text. It was a land deed for the Yates property, signed and notarized. But something about it struck her as wrong. The ink seemed too fresh, the signature too perfect, and the paper itself lacked the yellowing that would be expected from a document several years old. He's been stealing land. Daniel continued, his voice growing weaker. One family at a time. Changes the records. Makes it look legal. But I found the original deed, hidden in the church records. Clara's mind raced back to what she'd witnessed in the minister's study, the careful alteration of documents, the practiced movements of someone who'd done such work many times before. The pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place, painting a picture of systematic corruption that reached far beyond simple greed. Your family, Clara said urgently, pressing the makeshift bandages against his wound. Where are they? Homestead, 3 miles north, along the ridge. Daniel's eyes were losing focus, but he managed to press the stained property title into her hands. You have to warn them. Tell them to run. He'll come for them tonight. But Daniel's hand lingered on hers for a moment longer than necessary, and he looked at her with an expression that seemed to carry years of unspoken knowledge. Clara, there's something else. Something about your family. Before he could finish the thought, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Clara's head snapped up, her heart hammering against her ribs as she spotted 3 riders cresting the nearby hill. Even at this distance, she could see the distinctive black coat of the minister among them. They're coming, she whispered. But Daniel had already lost consciousness, his body going limp in her arms. Clara made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Instead of running, instead of abandoning this wounded man to save herself, she grabbed his arms and began dragging him toward a thicket of brush that offered concealment. Her slight frame and years of malnutrition made the task nearly impossible. But she used the sloping ground to her advantage, half-rolling, half-sliding Daniel's body down the embankment toward the undergrowth. The property title crinkled in her pocket as she worked its weight, seeming to grow heavier with each passing moment. She was no longer just a banished orphan girl. She was now the keeper of evidence that could expose the minister's crimes and save an innocent family from ruin. But first, she had to survive long enough to deliver it. Clara had barely managed to drag Daniel's unconscious form into the dense undergrowth when the riders reached the creek bank. She crouched in the shadows, one hand pressed over Daniel's mouth to muffle any sound he might make, the other clutching the stained property title that had become her most precious and dangerous possession. Through the tangle of branches, she could see Deputy Marcus Halvers dismounting from his horse, his badge catching the early morning sunlight. He was a thick-set man with cruel eyes and a reputation for asking questions with his fists rather than his words. Behind him rode the minister and another man Clara didn't recognize, a lean figure with a weathered look of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. Blood trail ends here, Halvers announced, kneeling beside the muddy bank where Daniel had fallen. But no body. Someone moved him. The minister's voice carried clearly across the water, his cold gaze scanning the landscape. Find him, deputy. A wounded man can't have gone far, and he's carrying something that belongs to me. Clara's grip tightened on the document. The minister's casual claim of ownership over the evidence that could expose his crimes sent a chill through her bones. She watched as Halvers began following the drag marks she'd left in the soft earth, his eyes scanning the ground with the practiced attention of a man who tracked both animals and men across the harsh frontier. Tracks lead toward the brush, the third rider observed. Could be wolves dragged him off. Or someone helped him. The minister replied, his unblinking stare fixing on the thicket where Clara and Daniel lay hidden. Someone who shouldn't be here. The search was methodical and thorough. Clara held her breath as Halvers poked through the undergrowth with a long stick, coming dangerously close to their hiding spot. Daniel stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping his lips, and Clara pressed her hand more firmly over his mouth, praying that the sound of the creek would mask any noise. The ravine system that scarred the landscape offered Clara her only hope of escape. While Halvers continued his search, she began to slowly work her way deeper into the brush, leaving Daniel concealed but moving herself toward the rocky gullies that cut through the terrain like ancient wounds. "Deputy Ho," the minister called out, his voice sharp with impatience. "We're wasting time. The girl was seen in this area last night. Find her." Clara's heart nearly stopped. They knew she was here. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just hiding from men looking for Daniel. She was the primary target of their search. The minister suspected she'd witnessed something, or perhaps he simply couldn't afford to have any loose ends from the previous night's violence. Halvers straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the brush line. "Clara Hensley." He called out, his voice echoing across the valley. "We know you're out there, girl. Come out now and we'll go easy on you." Clara remained motionless, but her mind was racing. She couldn't stay hidden forever, and Daniel needed medical attention that she couldn't provide. More importantly, the document in her pocket was useless as long as she remained trapped in the wilderness. She had to get to the Yates homestead, had to warn Daniel's family before the minister's men reached them. A small stone, perfectly sized for throwing, lay within reach. Clara had learned to be accurate with such projectiles during her years of being chased by the minister's rage. Sometimes the only way to escape a beating was to create a distraction. She picked up the stone and hurled it with all her strength toward a cluster of rocks 50 yards away. The stone struck with a sharp crack, and all three men turned toward the sound. "There," Halvers shouted, spurring his horse toward the noise. Clara used the distraction to break from cover, running low through the tall grass toward the nearest ravine. She could hear shouts behind her, followed by the thunder of hoofbeats as the men gave chase. But she had a head start, and she knew the terrain better than they did. The ravine was deeper than she'd expected, and Clara found herself sliding down the loose scree on her belly, her dress tearing on sharp rocks. She pressed herself against the rock wall, breathing hard as the sound of hoofbeats thundered overhead. Halvers had dismounted and was working his way down into the gully, his gun drawn, and his face twisted with determination. Clara backed deeper into the narrow passage, her heart hammering against her ribs as she searched for another way out. The confrontation came suddenly. Halvers rounded a bend in the narrow passage and found himself face to face with the girl he'd been hunting. For a moment they stared at each other across 10 feet of rocky ground, predator and prey locked in a deadly tableau. "Well, well," Halvers said softly, his gun steady in his hand. "End of the line, orphan girl." Clara's hand moved instinctively to her pocket, where the document crinkled softly against her fingertips. "I haven't done anything wrong. That's not for you to decide." Halvers stepped closer, his free hand extended. "Hand over whatever you took from the creek. Make this easy on yourself." "I don't know what you're talking about." Halvers' expression hardened. "The hard way it is, then." He lunged forward, trying to grab her with his free hand while keeping his gun trained on her chest. Clara twisted away, but his fingers caught the edge of her dress, and for a moment they struggled in the narrow confines of the ravine. The title started to slip from her pocket, and she made a desperate grab for it. Her shaking fingers closing around the blood-stained paper, just as Halvers' hand clamped down on her wrist. "Got it," he snarled, trying to wrestle the document away from her. Clara did the only thing she could think of. She opened her mouth and bit down on his hand, as hard as she could, her teeth sinking into the soft flesh between his thumb and forefinger. Halvers screamed in pain and rage, his grip loosening just enough for Clara to tear herself free. She bolted deeper into the ravine, her legs pumping as she searched for a way out. Behind her, Halvers' curses echoed off the rocky walls, followed by the sound of his boots scrambling over the loose stones. A narrow chimney in the rock wall offered her last hope, a gap barely wide enough for her small frame to squeeze through. Clara threw herself into the opening, her ribs scraping against the rough stone as she climbed toward the surface. She could hear Halvers below, his voice raw with frustration, as he realized he was too large to follow her through the narrow passage. She emerged onto a ledge high above the ravine floor, her chest heaving and her dress hanging in tatters. Below her, Halvers stood in the narrow passage, his face red with fury, and his bitten hand dripping blood onto the rocky ground. "This isn't over, girl," he shouted up at her. "We'll find you, and when we do, you'll wish you'd never been born." Clara pressed herself against the rock face, the document still clutched in her trembling hands. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The minister's men would regroup, and they would come for her again. More importantly, they would go after Daniel's family, and time was running out. She began her careful descent from the ledge, using handholds and footholds that years of scrambling through the rocky terrain had taught her to find. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and each passing moment brought Daniel's family closer to the same fate that had nearly claimed him. Clara took a deep breath and began the long journey toward the Yates homestead, carrying with her the evidence that could expose the minister's crimes if she could survive long enough to deliver it. The news of Clara's theft spread through Redemption Creek faster than a wildfire through dry grass. By midday, the minister had transformed the narrative from a simple exile to a dangerous criminal manhunt. In the saloon, the general store, and every gathering place in town, and the same story was repeated with growing embellishment. The orphan girl had stolen valuable property and attacked a deputy in the process. Clara learned this firsthand when she attempted to approach the town's outskirts in search of supplies. Hiding behind a weathered grain silo, she watched as Deputy Halvers organized search parties, his bandaged hand a testament to their earlier encounter. The men who volunteered carried rifles and grim expressions, their faces set, with the determination of citizens protecting their community from a perceived threat. "She's probably rabid," one of the searchers declared, checking his ammunition. "Bit me like a wild animal." "My minister says she's been touched by the devil," another added, crossing himself. "Can't trust anything she says." Clara's blood ran cold as she realized the full scope of the minister's manipulation. He wasn't just hunting her to recover the document, he was systematically destroying any credibility she might have if she tried to expose his crimes. Who would believe the word of an orphan girl branded as a thief and a lunatic? She retreated deeper into the wilderness, following deer trails and dry creek beds that would hide her tracks. The terrain grew increasingly harsh as she climbed toward the ridge where the Yates homestead was located. Sharp rocks cut through her worn shoes, and the relentless sun beat down on her uncovered head, making her dizzy with dehydration. By afternoon, the baying of hounds echoed across the valley. The minister had brought in tracking dogs from a neighboring ranch, and Clara could hear them getting closer with each passing hour. She pressed on, driven by desperation and the knowledge that Daniel's family was counting on her, even if they didn't know it yet. Her first sanctuary came in the form of an abandoned schoolhouse, its windows broken and its roof partially collapsed. Clara had heard stories about the building. It had been constructed with great hope during the territory's early settlement. But harsh winters and harder times had driven most of the families away. Now it stood as a monument to dreams deferred and lives disrupted. The sound of approaching riders made her heart race. Through a crack in the wall, she saw them coming, a group of 6 men, led by Marcus Boone, the minister's eldest son. Marcus was 25 years old, with his father's cold gaze and his mother's cruel mouth. He'd inherited both his father's position as deputy minister and his talent for finding new ways to make Clara's life miserable. "Search every building," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "She's got to be hiding somewhere." Clara's mind raced as she heard boots on the wooden steps of the schoolhouse. She couldn't run, they would see her the moment she left the building. But staying meant certain capture, and capture meant death. There had to be another option. The old schoolhouse was filled with decades of accumulated debris, broken furniture, moldering books, and scattered supplies from its abandoned days. Clara quickly began stacking the heaviest items against the front door, creating a barricade that would buy her precious time. Then she overturned desks and arranged them to create a maze of obstacles that would slow down anyone trying to move through the building. She was tying a length of rope between two desks when the door burst open. Marcus stood silhouetted in the doorway, his hunting rifle trained on her chest. Behind him, two other men spread out to flank her position. "Clever girl," Marcus said, his voice filled with dark amusement. "But not clever enough." Clara continued working with the rope, her fingers steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "What do you want, Marcus?" "What I've always wanted," he replied, stepping carefully through the maze of overturned furniture. "To see you put in your proper place." "And where's that?" "6 feet under, I reckon." Clara finished tying the rope and stepped back, her hands raised as if in surrender. "Before you kill me, don't you want to know what I found at the creek?" Marcus paused, his rifle still aimed at her chest. "I know what you found. Property that doesn't belong to you. I found the truth about what your father really is." Clara said, her voice carrying across the dusty room. "About what he's done to families all across this territory." "My father is a man of God," Marcus replied. But there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "Your father is a murderer," Clara shot back. "And if you help him, you're no better than he is." The accusation hung in the air between them. And for a moment, Clara thought she saw doubt flicker in Marcus's eyes. But then his expression hardened, and she knew that whatever conscience he might have once possessed had been crushed by years of his father's influence. "You're coming with us," Marcus said, stepping forward. "Father wants to have a conversation with you before—" His words were cut off as his foot caught the rope Clara had stretched between the desks. He stumbled, his rifle discharging into the ceiling as he fought to maintain his balance. Clara was already moving, diving through the gap in the wall that she'd spotted earlier. She heard shouts behind her as Marcus's men tried to follow, but the maze of furniture slowed them down just enough for her to reach the outside. Her horse, stolen from the minister's own stable during her escape, was waiting behind the building, and she vaulted onto its back with the desperation of someone who knew that capture meant death. The chase that followed was wild and desperate. Clara's stolen horse was fast, but Marcus and his men knew the terrain better than she did. They drove her toward the rougher country, where the rocky ground and sudden drop-offs made high-speed riding treacherous. Clara's salvation came in the form of a narrow canyon that cut through the landscape like a knife wound. The passage was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, and the walls rose steeply on both sides. It was dangerous, but it was also her only chance to lose her pursuers. She spurred her horse into the canyon, the animal's hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground. Behind her, she could hear Marcus shouting orders, but the walls of the canyon muffled his words. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow that Clara's knees scraped against the stone walls. When she emerged from the canyon, she found herself in a hidden valley that she'd never seen before. The landscape was different here, softer, more welcoming, with grass that grew thick and green near a small stream. But more importantly, she could see the Yates homestead in the distance, its smoke rising lazily from the chimney. Clara pushed her exhausted horse toward the ranch, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was bringing danger to the only family that had ever shown her kindness. But she had no choice. Daniel's family needed to know what was coming, and she was the only one who could warn them. As she approached the homestead, Clara noticed that something was wrong. The usual sounds of daily life, children playing, animals moving about, the everyday bustle of a working ranch, were absent. The place felt too quiet, too still. She dismounted near the barn and approached the house carefully, her senses alert for any sign of danger. The front door stood slightly ajar, and she could see that the windows had been recently boarded up from the inside. "Mrs. Yates," Clara called softly. "It's Clara Hensley. I have something from your husband." The door opened a crack, and Sarah Yates peered out, her face pale with fear. "Clara, what are you doing here? It's not safe." "I know," Clara replied, pulling the stained property title from her pocket. "That's why I'm here." Sarah opened the door wider, and Clara stepped inside to find the family barricaded in their own home. Furniture had been pushed against the windows, and the two children, Tommy and Mary, huddled close to their mother, their faces white with terror. "What's happened here?" Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The minister's men came this morning." Sarah explained, her voice shaking. "They said we had to sign papers transferring our land to the church. When we refused," she gestured toward the boarded windows, "they started shooting." Clara's heart sank as she realized that she was too late. The minister's plan was already in motion, and the Yates family was trapped in their own home, waiting for the final assault that would claim their lives and their property. But Clara had evidence now, proof of the minister's crimes, that could expose his corruption if she could get it to the right people. The question was whether she could keep the family alive long enough to make that evidence count. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the stained property title, showing it to Sarah Yates in the dim light of the barricaded house. The document was more than just evidence of forgery. It was a death warrant for everyone who had seen it. "This is our land deed," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "But Daniel's signature, the date, none of this is right. Your husband said the minister has been forging documents." Clara explained, her voice low and urgent. "Stealing land from families across the territory, one homestead at a time, making it look legal." Sarah's face crumpled as the full scope of the deception became clear. "The papers he showed us last week, claiming we owed back taxes we never heard of, saying our original deed was invalid. That's how he does it," Clara continued. "He creates false debts, questions the validity of existing deeds, then swoops in to legally claim the property. But your husband found the real documents hidden in the church records." Tommy looked up from his mother's side, his young face twisted with confusion and anger. "But he's a minister. He's supposed to help people, not hurt them." Clara's expression hardened. "Some people wear God's name like a mask to hide the devil underneath." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. But this time Clara recognized the distinctive rhythm of a single rider approaching at a steady pace. Through a gap in the boarded windows, she could see the minister himself riding alone, his black coat stark against the afternoon sky. "He's coming back," Sarah whispered. "He was here earlier demanding we sign over the property. When we refused, he said he'd give us until sunset to reconsider." Clara's mind raced. The minister's confidence in riding alone suggested that he had some advantage, some leverage that made him certain of victory. But what could make him so sure of himself? The answer came from an unexpected source. As the minister dismounted in front of the house, Tommy suddenly went rigid, his face draining of color. "Mama," he whispered, his voice filled with a terror that went beyond the current danger. "That's the man from my dreams, the one who comes to take people away." Sarah looked at her son in confusion. "What do you mean, Tommy?" "I've been dreaming about him for months," Tommy continued, his young voice shaking. "He comes in the night and people disappear. But in the dreams, he's younger, and there's a woman with him. A woman who looks like Clara." Clara felt her heart stop. "What woman?" "She has your eyes," Tommy said, his gaze fixed on Clara's face. "And she's always crying, always begging him not to hurt someone. But he never listens." The pieces of a puzzle that Clara had been unconsciously assembling for years suddenly fell into place with sickening clarity. The minister's strange behavior around her, his occasional moments of what she had mistaken for kindness, his insistence on keeping her close despite her rebellious nature. It all made sense now. He knew my mother. Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. He knew her well. Before Sarah could respond, the minister's voice carried clearly through the boarded windows. Mrs. Yates, I know you're in there, and I know you're not alone. Clara, my dear, why don't you come out? We have so much to discuss. Clara's blood ran cold. The minister's tone was almost conversational, as if he were inviting her to tea rather than threatening her life. But underneath the false gentleness, she could hear something else, a note of personal satisfaction, as if this confrontation was something he had been looking forward to for years. I'm not coming out. Clara called back, her voice stronger than she felt. I know what you are, and I know what you've done. The minister's laugh was soft and chilling. Oh, my dear child, you know so little about what I've done. But you're about to learn so much more. There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine sadness. Did you know that your mother was the most beautiful woman I ever saw, Catherine Hensley, with her shining hair and her stubborn green eyes? She could have had anything she wanted, anyone she wanted. But she chose poorly. Clara's world tilted on its axis. What are you talking about? I offered her everything, Clara. My protection, my love, a position of respect in the community. But she refused me. She chose your father instead, a poor surveyor with nothing to offer but empty promises and hard work. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she began to understand the true scope of the minister's obsession. You killed them because she rejected you. I killed them because they were spreading lies about me. The minister replied, his voice hardening. Your mother had started asking questions about certain irregularities in the land records. She was threatening to expose work that had taken me years to accomplish. Clara felt something break inside her chest, not just her heart, but her entire understanding of her own history. You murdered my parents because you couldn't have my mother. I eliminated a threat to the community I was building. The minister corrected. Your mother was dangerous, Clara. She had a way of making people believe in causes that were bigger than themselves. She would have destroyed everything I'd worked for. The truth was even worse than Clara had imagined. Her parents hadn't died of cholera. They'd been murdered by a man who had spent years nurturing a twisted obsession with her mother. And she had been raised by their killer, shaped by his hands, fed by his table. But I kept you alive. The minister continued, his voice taking on a note of pride. I could have killed you along with them, but I didn't. I raised you, cared for you, taught you the value of hard work and obedience. In my way, I've been a father to you. You've been a monster. Clara replied, her voice thick with tears of rage and grief. You killed my parents and then tortured me for 7 years. I prepared you, the minister said simply, for this moment when you would finally understand your place in the world. You see, Clara, you're not just a witness to my crimes. You're the final piece of unfinished business from your mother's rebellion. The horrible logic of his plan began to dawn on Clara. The minister hadn't just been covering up his crimes, he'd been orchestrating an elaborate revenge against the woman who had rejected him. Keeping Clara alive, raising her in poverty and servitude, had been his way of torturing Catherine Hensley's memory. You're going to kill us all. Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The Yates family, me, anyone who might testify about what you've done. I'm going to finish what I started 15 years ago, the minister replied. I'm going to create a community where my word is law, where there are no questions and no challenges to my authority. And you, my dear Clara, are going to help me do it. You never, Clara said, her voice carrying the same stubborn defiance that had once marked her mother's character. Oh, but you will, the minister said, his tone becoming almost gentle. Because if you don't, I'll make sure that the Yates children suffer the same fate as their parents, slowly, painfully, while you watch." Clara looked at Tommy and Mary, their young faces white with terror, and felt the weight of their lives pressing down on her shoulders. She was trapped between impossible choices: surrender to the minister's demands, and betray everything her parents had died for, or resist and watch innocent children pay the price for her defiance. But then Sarah spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Clara, there's something you need to know. Something Daniel was trying to tell you at the creek." Clara turned to look at her, confused by the sudden change in topic. "What?" "Daniel is your cousin," Sarah said simply. "His mother was Catherine's sister. They were separated when they were young, but Daniel never forgot the family he'd lost. When he saw you in town, he knew immediately who you were." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. She wasn't alone in the world. She had family, real family people, who had cared about her parents and who cared about her. Daniel's kindness toward her hadn't been simple charity. It had been the love of a relative who had recognized his lost cousin's daughter. "He's been trying to find a way to tell you," Sarah continued. "He's been investigating the minister's crimes, not just to protect our land, but to get justice for Catherine and Michael. He's been carrying their memory for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to strike back." Clara felt a surge of emotion that was equal parts grief and determination. She wasn't just fighting for the Yates family. She was fighting for her own blood, for the memory of parents she had barely known, for the justice that had been denied for 15 years. The minister's greatest mistake, Clara said, her voice growing stronger with each word, was keeping me alive. He thought he could break me, could turn me into a weapon against my own family's memory. But he was wrong. Outside, the minister's patience was wearing thin. "Your time is up, Clara. Come out now and the children might live through this." Clara looked at the stained property title in her hands, at the evidence that could expose the minister's crimes, if she could get it to the right people. But more than that, she looked at the faces of the family that had just become her family, and she knew that she would do whatever it took to protect them. "Mrs. Yates," she said quietly, "is there another way out of this house?" Sarah nodded toward the back of the building. "The root cellar has a tunnel that leads to the barn. Daniel built it during the Indian troubles. Then that's how you're going to escape," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of finality. "Take the children and get to the territorial capital. Find a federal marshal, someone who's not in the minister's pocket." "What about you?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Clara looked toward the front of the house, where the minister waited with the patience of a predator who knew his prey was trapped. "I'm going to finish what my parents started," she said quietly. "I'm going to make sure that monster never hurts anyone again." The minister's obsession with her mother had been his strength for 15 years, driving him to accumulate power and eliminate threats with ruthless efficiency. But Clara was about to turn that obsession into his weakness, using his twisted feelings as a weapon against him. The final confrontation was approaching, and Clara Hensley was ready to claim her inheritance of courage and justice. The minister's patience finally snapped as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Clara watched through the gaps in the boarded windows as he dismounted from his horse, his movements deliberate and predatory. Behind him, she could see more riders approaching, 6 armed men who had been waiting just beyond the ridge, ready to support their leader's final assault. "Mrs. Yates." The minister called out, his voice carrying the same tone he used during Sunday sermons. "You have 1 minute to send Clara out to me. After that, I'm afraid I can't be responsible for what happens to your children." Sarah clutched Tommy and Mary closer to her sides, her face pale with terror. "He's going to kill us all anyway," she whispered. Clara nodded grimly. "But we're not going to make it easy for him." She moved to the back of the house, where the root cellar door stood slightly ajar. The tunnel that Daniel had excavated during the Indian troubles was narrow and dark, but it offered the only hope of escape for the family. Clara pressed the stained property title into Sarah's hands. "Now take this," she said. "It's the evidence you'll need to expose his crimes. Get to the territorial capital and find someone who'll listen." "Come with us," Sarah pleaded. "We can all escape together." Clara shook her head. "Someone has to hold them off long enough for you to get away. And besides, I have my own business to settle with him." The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house as the minister's men began their assault on the front door. Clara had barricaded it as best she could, but she knew it wouldn't hold for long. She needed to buy Sarah and the children more time. Moving to the bedroom, Clara found Daniel's rifle and ammunition. She had watched him clean and load the weapon many times during her visits to the homestead, and she prayed that observation would be enough to make her effective with it. Her hands shook as she loaded the cartridges, but she forced herself to remain calm. The front door gave way with a crash, and Deputy Halvers charged through the opening, his gun drawn, and his face twisted with rage. Clara had been waiting for this moment, positioned behind an overturned table with a clear view of the doorway. Her first shot went wide, the rifle's kick nearly knocking her off her feet. But the muzzle flash and the thunderous report were enough to send Halvers diving for cover, buying her precious seconds to chamber another round. "She's got a gun," Halvers shouted to his companions. Clara's second shot was more accurate, catching one of the minister's men in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man screamed and fell backward through the doorway, his blood spraying across the wooden floor. "Spread out," the minister commanded from outside. "Take her alive if you can, but don't let her escape." Clara knew she was outnumbered and outgunned, but she had one advantage: she was fighting for her family's memory and her own survival, while the minister's men were fighting for money and fear. Desperation could make up for a lot of disadvantages. She moved to a different window, keeping low as bullets splintered the wood around her. Through the gap, she could see the minister himself standing calmly in the yard, as if he were watching a mildly interesting spectacle, rather than a gunfight. "Clara," he called out, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of gunfire. "This is pointless. You can't win, and you're only making things worse for yourself." Clara's response was to put a bullet through the window frame inches from his head. The minister didn't flinch, but she saw something flicker in his eyes, a recognition that she was more dangerous than he had anticipated. The battle for the house continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Clara moved from window to window, firing when she had a clear shot, and then relocating before return fire could find her. She managed to wound 2 more of the minister's men, but her ammunition was running low. More importantly, she could hear sounds from the back of the house that told her Sarah and the children were making their escape through the tunnel. Every minute she could hold out gave them a better chance of reaching safety, but the minister was growing impatient. "Burn them out," he ordered, his voice cold with fury. "I'm tired of playing games." Clara's heart sank as she saw one of the men approaching the house with a torch. She had 1 shot left, and she made it count, putting a bullet through the man's chest before he could reach the building. But there were more torches, more men, and she was down to her last few cartridges. The smell of smoke began to fill the house as the minister's men set fire to the back wall. Clara knew that she had perhaps minutes before the building became a death trap. She had to act now, while she still had the element of surprise. Making a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier, Clara gathered the last of her courage and stepped out of the burning house to face her parents' killer. The minister stood in the yard, his black coat making him look like death itself in the flickering light of the flames. When he saw Clara emerge from the smoke, his face broke into a smile that was somehow more terrifying than any expression of rage. "There's my brave girl," he said, his voice filled with twisted pride. "I knew you wouldn't disappoint me." Clara raised the rifle, her hand steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "You killed my parents." "I did what was necessary," the minister replied, stepping closer. "Your mother was spreading lies about me, turning people against the work I was doing. She would have destroyed everything I'd built. She was investigating your crimes. Clara said, her voice growing stronger. She was trying to protect innocent families from a monster. The minister's smile widened. She was trying to protect you, actually. Did you know that she came to me the night before she died, begging me to spare your life? She offered to take her family and leave the territory forever if I would just let you grow up in peace. Clara's vision blurred with tears, but she kept the rifle trained on the minister's chest. What did you tell her? I told her that it was too late for bargains, the minister replied. I told her that she should have thought about the consequences before she started asking questions. And then I killed her, Clara. I killed her while she was begging for your life. The cruelty of the revelation was designed to break Clara's spirit, to send her into a rage that would make her careless. But instead, it had the opposite effect. The knowledge that her mother had died trying to protect her filled Clara with a cold, implacable fury that steadied her hands and cleared her mind. You made a mistake, Clara said quietly. Oh, and what's that? You kept me alive. You thought you could break me, could turn me into a weapon against my own family's memory. But all you did was create someone who would never stop fighting you. The minister's smile faltered slightly. You're just a child, Clara. A broken, traumatized child who doesn't understand how the world really works. I'm Catherine Hensley's daughter, Clara replied, and I understand enough. She pulled the trigger, but the minister was already moving, diving to the side as the bullet passed through the space where he had been standing. Clara tried to chamber another round, but the magazine was empty. The minister rose to his feet, his face twisted with rage. You stupid girl, you've ruined everything. He pulled a pistol from his coat and pointed it at Clara's chest. You could have lived, could have found a place in the world I was building. But you chose to be your mother's daughter instead. Clara stood her ground, her empty rifle still in her hands. I chose to be human instead of a monster. The minister's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. Both Clara and the minister turned to see a group of riders cresting the ridge federal marshals, their badges glinting in the firelight. It's over, Clara said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. Sarah made it to the territorial capital. The whole world is about to learn what you really are. The minister's face went white with rage and desperation. This isn't over, he snarled. I'll find a way to escape, and when I do, I'll hunt you down and finish what I started. No, Clara said simply. You won't. She dropped the empty rifle and walked toward the burning house, her movements calm and purposeful. The minister watched in confusion as she disappeared into the smoke, his mind struggling to understand what she was planning. When Clara emerged from the flames, she was carrying something in her hands, a wooden box that she had retrieved from the wreckage of the house. Inside the box, protected by oiled leather, were documents that would expose not just the minister's crimes, but the entire network of corruption that had enabled them. These are the real land records, Clara announced, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. The ones my parents died trying to protect. They prove that every transaction you've made for the past 15 years has been based on fraud. The minister's face contorted with fury. You don't understand what you're doing. Those documents will destroy the entire territorial government. Good, Clara replied. Maybe it's time to start over with people who actually deserve to lead. The federal marshals were close enough now that Clara could see their faces in the firelight. She recognized the lead marshal, a man named Patterson, who had a reputation for honesty and competence. He would listen to her story, would examine the evidence, and would make sure that justice was finally served. But the minister wasn't finished yet. In a final act of desperation, he raised his pistol and fired at Clara, his shot wild with rage and fear. The bullet caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her to her knees. Clara felt the box slipping from her hands, its precious contents scattering across the ground. She tried to gather the documents, but her wounded arm wouldn't obey her commands. The minister was advancing on her, his gun raised for a killing shot. "You should have stayed broken," he snarled. "You should have accepted your place in the world." Clara looked up at him, her face streaked with blood and tears, but her eyes still blazing with defiance. "My place is right here," she said quietly. "Standing up to monsters like you." The minister's response was cut short as Marshal Patterson's rifle cracked across the valley. The bullet took the minister in the chest, knocking him backward and sending his pistol spinning away into the darkness. As the minister fell, Clara felt something that she had never experienced before. A sense of completion of justice finally served. Her parents' deaths had been avenged, the Yates family was safe, and the documents that would expose the minister's crimes were scattered on the ground around her. She had survived the second obstacle, but the final confrontation was yet to come. The minister was wounded, but not dead, and Clara knew that a wounded predator was often the most dangerous of all. The storm that had been building all day finally broke as Marshal Patterson and his men surrounded the burning homestead. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, illuminating the scene in stark black and white. Clara kneeling in the mud, her shoulder bleeding from the minister's shot. The minister himself lying wounded but still breathing, his black coat torn and bloodied. And the scattered documents that represented 15 years of systematic murder and theft. Clara forced herself to her feet, her vision blurring from pain and blood loss. The minister was trying to crawl toward his fallen pistol, his face a mask of rage and desperation. She couldn't let him reach it, not when they were so close to finally exposing his crimes. "Marshal Patterson." Clara called out, her voice carrying over the thunder. "Don't let him get to that gun." But the minister was closer to the weapon than the marshals were, and his desperation gave him strength that Clara wouldn't have thought possible. His fingers closed around the pistol's grip, just as Patterson reached him. "Drop it," Patterson commanded, his own rifle trained on the minister's head. The minister's response was to roll over and fire at Clara, his shot wild but close enough to send her diving for cover behind the water trough. "You stupid girl," he screamed, his voice raw with fury. "You've destroyed everything I've built." The confession was exactly what Patterson needed to hear. "Silas Boone," he said formally, "you're under arrest for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Drop your weapon and surrender." But the minister was beyond reason now, his carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling like the burning house behind him. "I am the law in this territory," he raged. "I am God's representative on earth. You have no authority over me." Clara saw her chance. While the minister was focused on Patterson, she began crawling toward the scattered documents, gathering them one by one, despite the pain in her shoulder. These papers were the key to everything, proof of the minister's crimes evidence that would expose the entire network of corruption he had built. "You want to know about authority?" Clara called out, her voice cutting through the rain and wind. "Let me tell you about my parents, Catherine and Michael Hensley. They had the authority of truth, and that's why you killed them." The minister's attention snapped back to her, his eyes blazing with the same obsession that had driven him for 15 years. "Your mother was a fool," he snarled. "She could have had everything, but she chose poverty and principle instead. She chose love over fear." Clara replied, clutching the documents to her chest. "She chose to fight for what was right instead of what was profitable." The minister's laugh was bitter and cruel. And where did that get her? Dead in a shallow grave, forgotten by everyone except her pathetic daughter. Clara felt something break inside her, not her spirit, but the last chains of fear and doubt that had bound her for 17 years. "Not forgotten," she said quietly. "Avenged." The minister raised his pistol, but this time Clara was ready. She had been watching him carefully, learning his patterns, waiting for the right moment. When he pulled the trigger, she was already moving, rolling behind the water trough, as the bullet whined past her ear, but Clara's movement had served a purpose beyond simple survival. As she rolled, she knocked over a lantern that had been sitting on the ground, sending burning oil spreading across the yard. The flames caught the minister's coat, and he screamed as he tried to beat out the fire. "Now you know how it feels," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of savage satisfaction. "Now you know what it's like to burn." The minister tore off his burning coat and threw it aside, but the distraction had given Patterson the opening he needed. The marshal's shot took the minister in the leg, dropping him to the ground and sending his pistol spinning away into the darkness. "It's over, Boone," Patterson said, advancing with his rifle still trained on the fallen man. "You're finished." But the minister wasn't finished yet. Even wounded and defeated, he had one last card to play. "You think you've won," he gasped, his voice thick with pain and hatred. "You think this changes anything? I have allies, Clara. People in high places who will protect me." Clara looked at the documents in her hands, then at the minister's face, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. He was telling the truth. He did have allies, people who would help him escape justice, even now. "Not anymore," she said quietly. "These documents don't just prove your crimes. They name your accomplices your allies, everyone who helped you build your kingdom of corruption." The minister's face went white as he realized the full scope of what Clara held. "You don't understand what you're doing," he whispered. "If you expose those names, you'll bring down the entire territorial government." "Then maybe it's time for a new government," Clara replied. "One that actually serves the people instead of preying on them." The minister's last gambit was desperate and pathetic. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I'll do anything. I'll confess to everything. I'll make reparations to the families I've wronged. Just don't expose those names." Clara looked at the man who had murdered her parents, who had tortured her for 7 years, who had built his fortune on the graves of innocent families. For a moment, she felt something that might have been pity, not for the minister, but for the broken, twisted thing he had become. "I might have considered it," she said finally. "If you had shown mercy to my parents. If you had shown mercy to the Morrison family or the Kellys or any of the other people you killed for your greed." The minister's face contorted with rage. "You self-righteous little bitch. You think you're so much better than me, but you're just as corrupt as I am. You're enjoying this, aren't you? You're enjoying watching me suffer." Clara considered his words carefully. "No," she said finally. "I'm not enjoying this. I'm completing it." She turned to Marshal Patterson, who had been watching the exchange with growing understanding. "Marshal, I want to make a formal statement. I want to testify about everything I've seen, everything I know about this man's crimes." Patterson nodded. "We'll take your statement, miss. But first, let's get you some medical attention." As the marshal and his men began to secure the scene, Clara felt a presence beside her. She turned to see Sarah Yates emerging from the darkness, her children safe behind her. The family had made it through the tunnel and had circled back to witness the final confrontation. "It's over," Sarah said quietly. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." Clara looked at the minister, who was being bandaged by one of the marshals. He was alive, but his power was broken. His network of corruption exposed. He would spend the rest of his life in prison if he was lucky. More likely, he would face the gallows for his crimes. Not quite over. Clara said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "There's still one more thing I need to do." She walked over to where the minister lay, his face pale with blood loss and defeat. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "My name is Clara Hensley," she said. "I am the daughter of Catherine and Michael Hensley, who you murdered 15 years ago. I have lived in your house, eaten your food, and endured your cruelty for 7 years. And now I am the instrument of your destruction." The minister's response was a whisper, barely audible above the storm. "You were supposed to be broken. You were supposed to accept your place." "My place," Clara replied, "is exactly where I am. Standing over your defeat, holding the evidence that will expose your crimes, surrounded by the family you tried to destroy." She held up the documents one final time, her voice carrying across the yard, with the authority of absolute truth. "These papers contain the names of every person you've killed, every property you've stolen, every crime you've committed. They will be submitted to the territorial court, and justice will finally be served." The minister's final words were lost in the thunder as the storm reached its peak. Lightning illuminated the scene one last time. Clara standing tall despite her wounds, the scattered evidence of 15 years of crime, and the broken man who had tried to build a kingdom on the graves of the innocent. The reign of terror that had gripped Redemption Creek for so long was finally over. But for Clara Hensley, the real work was just beginning. Dawn came gray and subdued, as if the very sky mourned the violence that had torn through the valley. Clara sat in the back of Marshal Patterson's wagon, her shoulder properly bandaged, and her mind struggling to process the events of the past 24 hours. The documents that had cost so many lives were secured in a leather satchel beside her, their pages slightly damp from the storm, but their contents intact. The minister rode in chains in a separate wagon, his face hollow and defeated. The network of corruption he had built over 15 years was crumbling as Patterson's men arrested his accomplices throughout the territory. Deputy Halvers was already dead killed in the gunfight at the homestead. Marcus Boone had been captured trying to flee to Mexico, and several members of the town council had been taken into custody. But Clara's thoughts were not on the minister's fate. Instead, she found herself thinking about the family she had gained and lost in the space of a single day. "Daniel's going to be fine," Sarah said as if reading her thoughts. "The doc says he'll be weak for a while, but he'll recover." Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure how she felt about her newly discovered cousin. The revelation that she had family, real family, had come at a moment when she was least prepared to process it. She had spent 7 years believing herself to be completely alone in the world, and the sudden knowledge that she had blood relatives who cared about her was almost as overwhelming as the violence she had survived. "He wants to see you," Sarah continued. "He's been asking about you since he regained consciousness." Clara looked at the woman who had shown her more kindness in a single day than she had received in years. "Mrs. Yates, I want you to know that what happened to your homestead, it's my fault. If I hadn't brought that document to you, you saved our lives." Sarah interrupted firmly. "Without your warning, we would have been murdered in our beds. My children are alive because of your courage." The words were meant to be comforting, but Clara felt only the weight of responsibility. She had survived the minister's reign of terror, but at what cost? The homestead was burned. Daniel was wounded, and the entire community was traumatized by the revelation of the crimes that had been committed in their midst. What happens now? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now we rebuild," Sarah replied. "We rebuild our lives, our community, our trust in each other. And we make sure that something like this never happens again." The wagon rolled into Redemption Creek, just as the townspeople were beginning to stir. Word of the minister's crimes had spread quickly, and Clara could see the shock and confusion on the faces of people who had trusted him for years. Some looked at her with something approaching awe, while others seemed to blame her for shattering their illusions. "They'll come around," Patterson said, noticing her discomfort. "It takes time for people to accept that they've been deceived. But the truth has a way of winning out in the end." Clara hoped he was right. She had risked everything to expose the minister's crimes, but she wasn't sure if the community would thank her for it. Sometimes people preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The next several days passed in a blur of testimony and legal proceedings. Clara found herself telling her story over and over again to judges investigators, and lawyers. The evidence she had gathered was overwhelming, and the minister's network of corruption began to unravel with frightening speed. But the process was exhausting both physically and emotionally. Clara had to relive the trauma of her parents' deaths as the years of servitude and the violence of the past day. She had to face the minister again in court, had to look into his eyes and recount his crimes in clinical detail. The minister himself seemed to have aged decades in the space of a few days. His carefully maintained facade of respectability was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man who had lost everything. He offered no defense, no justification for his actions. He simply sat in silence as the full scope of his crimes was revealed to the world. 43 families, the prosecutor announced during the trial. 43 families murdered or driven from their homes. Hundreds of innocent people killed to satisfy one man's greed. The numbers were staggering. But Clara found that they didn't capture the true horror of what had happened. Each number represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future stolen. The minister hadn't just been stealing land, he had been stealing hope itself. When the trial ended, the minister was sentenced to death by hanging. Clara felt no satisfaction in the verdict, only a sense of completion. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the dead or heal the wounds that had been inflicted on the community. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself struggling with questions about her own future. She had accomplished what she had set out to do. She had exposed the minister's crimes and brought him to justice. But what came next? Where did an orphan girl with no home and no family go when her quest for justice was complete? The answer came from an unexpected source. Daniel Yates, still recovering from his wounds, sent word that he wanted to see her. When Clara arrived at his bedside, she found him looking weak but determined. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I should have told you the truth about our family connection years ago." Clara sat beside his bed, studying the face that, now that she knew to look for it, bore a striking resemblance to her mother's. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was a coward," Daniel replied honestly. "I knew what the minister was capable of, and I was afraid that if I acknowledged our relationship, it would put you in even greater danger." Clara considered this. "You were protecting me. I was protecting myself," Daniel corrected. "I was afraid that if I stood up to him, he would do to my family what he had done to yours. It took almost losing everything to make me realize that the danger was there, whether I acknowledged it or not." Clara felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in her life, she was talking to someone who had known her parents not as distant memories, but as real people with hopes and dreams and flaws. "Tell me about them," she said quietly. "Tell me about my mother and father." Daniel's face softened. "Your mother was the strongest person I ever knew. She had a way of making people believe that things could be better, that justice was possible even in a place like this. Your father was quieter, but he was the most honest man I ever met. He would have done anything for your mother, and both of them would have died for you. They did die for me." Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "The minister said that my mother came to him the night before she died, begging him to spare my life." Daniel nodded. "That sounds like Catherine. She never gave up, never stopped fighting for what was right, even when she knew it would cost her everything." They talked for hours, sharing memories and stories, gradually building a connection that had been denied them for years. Clara learned about her extended family, about cousins and aunts and uncles who had been scattered across the frontier. She learned about her parents' courtship, their hopes for the future, their plans for raising their daughter in a world that might be better than the one they had known. But most importantly, she learned that she was not alone. The minister's greatest cruelty had been to isolate her, to make her believe that she had no one in the world who cared about her. The revelation of her family connection to Daniel changed everything. "I want you to know," Daniel said as their conversation drew to a close, that you will always have a home with us. Sarah and the children love you and your family. You'll never have to face the world alone again." Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." But even as she spoke, Clara knew that she couldn't simply settle into domestic life. The events of the past weeks had changed her in fundamental ways, had shown her that she had a role to play in the world beyond the boundaries of any single family or community. "I'm grateful for the offer," she said carefully. "More grateful than I can express. But I think I need to find my own path forward." Daniel studied her face, seeing something in her expression that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "What do you have in mind?" Clara had been thinking about this question for days, and the answer had gradually become clear. "I want to make sure that what happened here never happens again. I want to help other families who are being taken advantage of by people in power." "You want to study law," Daniel said, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I want to learn how to fight corruption legally," Clara replied. "I want to be the person who stands up for families like yours, who makes sure that justice is available to everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Your parents would be proud of you." "I hope so," Clara said. "I hope they know that their deaths weren't in vain, that the evidence they died trying to protect finally saw the light of day." As she prepared to leave Daniel's bedside, Clara felt a sense of closure that she had never experienced before. She had avenged her parents' deaths, saved an innocent family, and exposed a network of corruption that had poisoned the territory for years. But more than that, she had discovered who she really was. Not just the broken orphan girl the minister had tried to create, but the daughter of heroes who had died fighting for justice. The road ahead would be difficult. Learning law would take years, and establishing herself in a profession dominated by men would be challenging. But Clara had survived 7 years of servitude, had faced down armed men, and had brought down a criminal who had seemed untouchable. She was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The minister's reign of terror was over, but Clara Hensley's work was just beginning. 6 months after the fire that consumed the minister's criminal empire, Clara stood in the doorway of the territorial attorney's office, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The view from the territorial capital was different from the harsh landscape of Redemption Creek, softer, somehow more civilized. But Clara had learned that civilization was often just a thin veneer over the same brutal realities that had shaped her childhood. Her work as a junior clerk had been challenging but rewarding. She had thrown herself into learning the intricacies of territorial law, spending long hours poring over legal texts and observing court proceedings. Her supervisors had been impressed by her dedication and her intuitive understanding of justice, and there was already talk of sponsoring her for formal legal training. But today was different. Today Clara was returning to Redemption Creek for the first time since her departure, carrying with her news that would change everything she thought she knew about her family. The investigation into the minister's crimes had been thorough and exhaustive. Federal marshals had uncovered evidence of corruption that reached far beyond the boundaries of Redemption Creek, implicating territorial officials and business leaders in a network of land fraud and murder that had operated for over a decade. The trials would continue for years, but the core of the conspiracy had been broken. Clara's role in exposing the crimes had made her something of a legend in the territory. Newspaper articles described her as the orphan girl who brought down a kingdom of corruption, and she had received letters from people across the frontier thanking her for her courage. But fame was not what she sought. She wanted justice, and more importantly, she wanted to ensure that the victims of the minister's crimes were not forgotten. The stagecoach that carried her back to Redemption Creek was comfortable and well-appointed, a far cry from the desperate flight through the storm that had marked her last night in the town. As the familiar landscape rolled past the windows, Clara reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Redemption Creek itself had undergone a transformation. The minister's influence had been so pervasive that his removal had created a vacuum that the community was still learning to fill. A new minister had been brought in from the territorial capital, a man whose first sermon had been about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of questioning authority. The Yates family had rebuilt their homestead using some of the compensation funds to construct a larger house and expand their operations. Daniel had recovered from his injuries and had become something of a local hero himself, praised for his role in gathering evidence against the minister. Sarah had started a school for the children of the valley, determined to ensure that the next generation would be better educated and more capable of defending themselves against those who would exploit them. Clara's first stop in town was the cemetery, where a new section had been created to honor the victims of the minister's crimes. 43 headstones stood in neat rows, each bearing the name of a person who had died for the simple crime of standing in the way of one man's greed. At the center of the memorial were 2 stones that Clara had personally commissioned, one for Catherine Hensley and one for Michael Hensley, finally acknowledged as the heroes they had been. "I thought I might find you here," a familiar voice said behind her. Clara turned to see Daniel Yates approaching his face, weathered by months of hard work, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a man who had reclaimed his life. He moved with only a slight limp now, a reminder of the bullet wound that had nearly cost him everything. "Daniel," Clara said, embracing him warmly. "It's good to see you." "It's good to see you too, Clara. You look different, more settled." Clara smiled. "I feel different. I know what I want to do with my life now. And what's that? I want to make sure that what happened here never happens again. I want to be the person who stands up for families like yours, who fights for justice when no one else will." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Your parents would be proud of you." "I hope so." Clara replied, her gaze returning to the headstones. "I hope they know that their deaths meant something, that they weren't just victims, but fighters who inspired others to carry on their work." They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, paying their respects to the dead. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice carrying a note of excitement. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "Something we found while rebuilding the house." He led her away from the cemetery, through the town, and out to the Yates homestead. The new house was larger and more substantial than the original, built from local stone and designed to withstand whatever hardships the frontier might throw at it. But Daniel didn't take her to the house. Instead, he led her to a small shed behind the barn. "We were digging the foundation for the new root cellar," he explained as they walked. "About 3 feet down, we hit something hard. At first, we thought it was just a boulder, but when we cleared away the dirt..." He opened the shed door to reveal a small iron strongbox, its surface pitted with rust, but still intact. "It was buried right where the old house used to stand," Daniel continued. "Hidden there for God knows how long." Clara's heart began to race as she realized what she was looking at. "Have you opened it?" "We were waiting for you," Daniel replied. "It seemed like something you should see first." With trembling hands, Clara lifted the lid of the strongbox. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, were dozens of documents: letters, photographs, maps, and official records. But at the top of the pile was a letter addressed in her mother's careful handwriting. "For Clara, when she is old enough to understand." Clara's vision blurred with tears as she unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then something has happened to your father and me, and you have grown up without knowing the truth about your family's history. I pray that this letter finds you strong and healthy, and that you have become the remarkable woman I know you can be. Your father and I have been investigating a conspiracy that reaches deep into the heart of this territory. We have evidence of crimes that would shock the decent people of our community. But we also know that we are in great danger. The man who calls himself a minister is nothing more than a common criminal, and he has powerful allies who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. We have hidden evidence of their crimes in places they will never think to look. Some of it is in this box, but more can be found in the false bottom of the old desk, in the schoolhouse, in the hollow tree by Miller's Creek, and in the cave behind the waterfall north of town. But Clara, my beloved daughter, there is something else you must know. Something that will change how you see your place in the world. Daniel Yates is not just a family friend, as we have always told you. He is your cousin. His mother was my sister, Mary Catherine Morrison. We were separated when we were young, when our parents died in a cholera outbreak in Missouri. Mary was adopted by a family named Morrison, while I was taken in by different relatives. We lost touch for many years, but we found each other again when we both settled in this territory. Daniel has always known the truth about our relationship, but we asked him to keep it secret. We wanted you to grow up feeling independent and strong, not burdened by obligations to family you barely knew. But if something happens to us, I want you to know that you are not alone in this world. Daniel and his family love you, and they will always be there for you. More than that, Clara, I want you to know that you come from a line of strong women who have never accepted injustice. Your grandmother, Sarah Morrison, was a station master on the Underground Railroad. Your great-grandmother, Rebecca Morrison, was one of the first women to homestead land in her own name. You carry their blood, their courage, and their determination to make the world a better place. Whatever you choose to do with your life, know that we are proud of you. Know that you are loved, that you are valued, and that you have the strength to overcome any obstacle that life puts in your path. Your loving mother, Catherine Morrison Hensley. Clara wiped the tears from her eyes and looked up at Daniel, who was watching her with a mixture of concern and anticipation. She knew. Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew you were my cousin. She made me promise to keep it secret. Daniel replied. She wanted you to choose your own path, to feel free to make your own decisions without feeling obligated to family. But she also wanted you to know that you weren't alone. Clara felt a surge of emotion that was equal parts grief and joy. Her mother had given her the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that she was part of something larger than herself, that she belonged to a family with a history of fighting for justice. There's more, Daniel said, reaching into the strongbox. Look at this. He handed her a photograph, a group portrait of a large family standing in front of a farmhouse. Clara recognized her mother immediately, a young woman with the same stubborn chin and determined eyes. But what struck her most was how many people were in the photograph. Dozens of relatives, all connected by bonds of blood and affection. That's your family, Daniel said simply. Your real family. Most of them are scattered across the frontier now, but they're still out there. Still fighting for what's right, still making the world a better place. Clara stared at the photograph, her mind reeling with the implications. She wasn't just the orphaned daughter of two murdered activists. She was part of a legacy of courage and justice that stretched back generations. Your mother was right about one thing, Daniel continued. You do come from a line of strong women. But Clara, you're not just continuing their legacy, you're creating your own. What you did to expose the minister's crimes, what you're doing now to learn law and fight corruption, that's not just about honoring the past. That's about building the future. Clara looked at the documents in the strongbox, then at the photograph of her extended family, and finally at Daniel's face. For the first time in her life, she truly understood who she was and where she belonged. I want to meet them, she said quietly. My family. I want to know their stories, to understand how they fought for justice in their own ways. Some of them are coming to the dedication ceremony next month, Daniel replied, when they unveil the memorial to the victims of the minister's crimes. It seemed fitting that they should be there to honor Catherine and Michael. Clara nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had spent so many years believing herself to be alone. But now she realized that she was part of something much larger, a network of people who shared her values and her commitment to justice. And Daniel, She said, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. For keeping my mother's secret, for protecting me when you could, for helping me find my way to the truth." "You don't need to thank me," Daniel replied. "We're family. That's what family does." Clara smiled, feeling a sense of peace and belonging that she had never experienced before. "Yes," she said quietly. "We are." As they walked back toward the house, Clara felt the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. She had solved the mystery of her parents' deaths, exposed the man who had murdered them, and discovered that she was part of a family with a proud tradition of fighting for justice. But more than that, she had found her own path forward. She would continue her legal studies, would become the advocate for the voiceless that her mother had died trying to be. She would use her skills and her knowledge to protect other families from the predators who stalked the frontier. The minister's greatest mistake had been thinking that he could break her, that he could turn her into a weapon against her own family's memory. Instead, he had forged her into something stronger than he could have imagined, a woman who would spend her life ensuring that justice prevailed over corruption, that truth triumphed over lies, and that the innocent were protected from those who would prey upon them. That evening, as Clara sat with the Yates family around their dinner table, she felt a sense of completion that she had never experienced before. She was no longer the broken orphan girl who had been cast out of the minister's house 6 months earlier. She was Clara Morrison Hensley, daughter of Hero's cousin to a family that had welcomed her with open arms and heir to a legacy of courage and justice. The minister had tried to steal her identity, her family, and her future. But in the end, he had only succeeded in making her stronger. Clara had not only survived his attempts to destroy her, she had turned his own weapons against him, using his crimes to expose the entire network of corruption he had built. As she prepared to return to the territorial capital the next morning, Clara felt a sense of anticipation that she had never experienced before. She knew who she was, now knew where she belonged, and knew what she wanted to accomplish with her life. The fight for justice was far from over, but Clara Hensley was ready to take her place in the battle. She had learned that even the most powerful predators could be brought down by someone willing to stand up for what was right. And she was determined to use that knowledge to protect others from the kind of evil that had once threatened to destroy her. The minister's reign of terror was over, but Clara's work was just beginning, and she was ready.